You are listening, or you are watching Midnight Radio. I'm your host, Jerry Adams. We're broadcasting to you live from the Badlands of Texas, from Southern Australia all the way to Northern Ireland. Today, we have a special guest with us. We have Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. Let me get him on the screen for you guys right now. Hello, Dr. Meldrum. Glad to have you here on Midnight Radio.
My pleasure.
Today. Now, let me let you guys know who Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum is, for those of you who don't know. And I would like to say this to you, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. I'll just call you Dr. Meldrum if you don't mind.
That's fine.
You're on here because you have fans. You have people who follow the Bigfoot community who want more of you. And they let me know, they're like, hey, you need to talk to this man. So this is Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. He's a full professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University since 1993. And I looked at that, and that screamed at me, 1993, because didn't you graduate in 1989?
Well, with my doctorate in 1989, yes, that's right.
In 1989, you went straight, but that was at Brigham Young University?
No, my doctorate was from SUNY Stony Brook.
Right.
And then I did a 2.5-year postdoc at Duke, and then 2.5 years at Northwestern University Medical Center before coming here to Pocatello.
So you moved a long way from home, but now your home is definitely Idaho.
That's right. That was right. We gravitated back to where our roots, as they say, are, and yeah, we're haven't regretted resettling back in the Rocky Mountains, which we call home. So
yeah. So now I want you guys, I'm going to read the rest of this, and I want you guys to pay attention because it lets you know exactly what he's an expert in. All right. He teaches human anatomy in the graduate health professions program. Again, that's human anatomy in the graduate health professions program. His research encompasses questions of vertebrate evolutionary morphology, generally primate, locomotor adaptations, more particularly, and especially the emergence of modern living bipedism. He co-edited volume From Biped to Strider, the emergence of modern human walking, running, resource transport, proposed a more recent innovation of modern striding gait than previously assumed. His interest in the footprints attributed to Sasquatch was piqued when he examined a set of 15-inch tracks in Washington in 1996. This was just about at the beginning of your career.
Right. It was, yeah.
Molding from those footprints?
Pardon?
Did you get a molding in 1996?
Oh yes. Yeah, I cast a whole series about, I think it was five or six examples from that trackway.
We were talking about some of his samples there before we started, and I've read his bio here, and he had about 500 samples of castings of feet.
About 300 at this point. Yeah.
300. Okay.
So 300, 500. I mean, once you've got a couple hundred, the message or the evidence is pretty clear.
You could probably use them to hold down your paperwork if you wanted to. At a foot on a grade. Wow. So you know about feet.
I do. I believe I do. Mm-hmm.
So when you were looking at these molds that you made starting in 1996, maybe before that, what do you see?
Well, the thing that really interested me, that piqued my curiosity, even beyond just the fundamental sensation of the possibility that these creatures really do exist, as evidenced by the footprints. What piqued my curiosity was the detail that was there, the evidence of the dynamic adaptations of this foot, its specializations for the type of walking on two legs. I mean, just because we're bipedal and they are bipedal, that is, walk on two legs, doesn't mean we do it in exactly the same way. And one of the things that was quite striking was a particular example that showed a very distinctive kind of speed bump, almost, it looked like, running across the foot, right about midway along its length. And I recognized that, having been familiar with the adaptations of the human foot and the recent innovation of the distinctive characteristics of our foot, namely a longitudinal arch, a fairly stiff arch that creates a stable platform for propelling our body forward. In contrast to that, this creature has a flat, flexible foot, as do our early ancestors, like the Australopithecines, Lucy. People may know one example by that nickname, but also in the great apes. I mean, this feature was first described in observations of the way chimpanzee feet worked. A researcher by the name of Hicks drew attention and coined the phrase mid-tarsal break. Not a break as in breaking a stick, but a break as in an axis of flexion, of folding, a crease. And that jumped out at me as an explanation for this feature of this pressure ridge. I mean, I mean, understanding something about the dynamics of the signatures of observable in human footprints, knowing about pressure releases, pressure discs, and so on. This was the most straightforward answer. And I remembered having seen something very similar to this in an illustration of one of the tracks from the Patterson-Gimlin film, in particular, one that was cast by Bob Titmus, and but had not been really appreciated or understood, and really not widely distributed. I had the chance early on to visit John Green and to meet Bob, but then at that point his health was already failing considerably, and was not in shape to entertain a lot of conversation interaction. But he did graciously allow me to examine his original cast material, and I mean, there was no getting over the remarkable resemblance. And anyway, I'm rambling on a little bit, but yeah, that was the focal point. That was the central headline, really. There we go. Yeah. And so you can see that's the Titmus cast. You can see that kind of people sometimes mistake it for an arch, and it's not. It's very different than the configuration of the human longitudinal arch. I mean, this is not, the foot is not shaped like that. There are other tracks in that trackway where that very flat but flexible foot has left a very flat imprint. It just depends on the dynamic qualities of the substrate, in this case, a sandy bank along a creek bed, and the dynamic of the walk itself, the forward impulse, causing weight to be concentrated in particular areas, and that some of that substrate to be kind of pushed back, or at least humped up, as other areas adjacent are compressed. And so that was really remarkable. In fact, I mean, so key, so central, that eventually, when I described the footprints, I created an ichnotaxon, that is a name and description and diagnosis of trace evidence of the footprints rather than the footprint maker itself, for which we don't have a physical specimen. And this is usually reserved for application to extinct fossil forms. But I was encouraged by those movers and shakers in that discipline that this was a potential worthy exception. And the manuscript passed peer review with flying colors and lots of support, and was published. And it provides a handle. I mean, we now have a name for Sasquatch footprints, and they are called Anthropoidopes ameriborealis, which is the North American footprint, basically, and North American ape footprint. And so now we can highlight those comparisons and contrasts, and we have a standard against which to compare other purported footprints or footprints attributed to Sasquatch. Do they exhibit the landmarks of shape, proportion, of articulation, of dynamic signature, etc. And so
There
it's
is a lot
useful.
to say about the feet and your experience in the feet. Matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, you did a whole chapter in one of your books
Oh yes,
with
yeah,
information data extrapolated from the study of the foot.
that's right. Chapter 13 in Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, and I kind of pulled the stops. I mean, I wanted to write a book that was accessible to general audience, but I also didn't want to shortchange the reader regarding the science behind this, for me, critical key element of the evidence.
Major critical. Now I read every author I have on here. I read the reviews, and I don't know if you guys read your reviews or not, but
Sure.
they're just ridiculous. Somebody's like, "Oh, why is he going on about the foot?" And I just don't know, why is he going to do. I'm like, "Are you kidding me? Do you realize the importance of it?" And this is where I want to go into it with you. And we
Yeah.
walked right into it.
Yeah.
We're talking about the Patterson film, which had a big
Sure.
change. It really had an impact on your life, but through the study of the foot. So what are we looking at here? What this man
Right.
is saying is, if you have the knowledge that he has, you can look at this foot and you can extrapolate the size of this beast.
Right. That's one thing, and also tell something about, again, the way that it walks. And in this case, you can one can look for corroboration of the hypothetical, the inferential interpretation of the footprint. Bear in mind, the footprint is not just like someone, stepping on some sand as if they were creating a mold of their foot. The footprint is the record of that dynamic interaction of the foot through the entire period of support, or stance phase we call, while the foot is in contact interacting with the substrate. So it's a dynamic. So, like, just like looking at that footprint with the speed bump, that's not the shape of the foot, but that's the deformation. There's a good way to put it. That's the deformation of the soil by the foot as it proceeds through that step cycle. So I've said over and over again, if I had only the footprints from the Patterson-Gimlin film site, I would be absolutely convinced that it was the real deal, because of the remarkable situation where we have this clarity that because of the substrate, it was a very fine eroded slate. The granules are very angular and locked together when compressed, as opposed to kind of a quartz sand where, unless it's really wet, it won't hold its shape. And then as it dries, you all know, as it dries, those footprints just kind of collapse in on it themselves until it's just a amorphous kind of crater. But these footprints held their shape. I mean, Bob Titmus went down there 10 days later, and could make an additional set of casts that were, had some weathering, some degradation, but still were a remarkable record of the variation in the individual footprints. John Green and Jim McLaren went down to the site to try to film Jim retracing the steps and get a comparative baseline of the size and dimensions of what appeared on the film. And Jim had no trouble following the trackway because the footprints held their shape so remarkably well. So when I talk about these interpretations, of a mid-tarsal break of a flat, flexible foot, I'm quite confident. In fact, I'm 100% confident in what I am concluding, because I can watch the track maker actually go through those very motions that I had inferred from the footprints themselves. So if you understand the kinematics of walking as well as the dynamic aspects of a footprint trace, then the two are correlated just remarkably, and confirm and corroborate one another in a very convincing way.
So for someone to actually see, I'm getting a little bit of someone to actually fake that to have a costume, how could they fake the foot?
Right. Right. Well, if you look at the attempts that have been allegedly made or attributed to a hoax, they're basically one of two things. You either have a stiff prosthetic foot carved out of a wooden plank, which has no flexibility, no mobility, and so all the dynamic aspects that involve midfoot flexibility would be just beyond the capability of that kind of a crude approach. The alternate would be some sort of a more flexible foot, prosthetic or fake foot. The problem was a lot of the materials that would immediately come to mind to try to attempt such a fake weren't readily available, except in very specialized circumstances to your average person, if they were even available at all. I'm thinking of something like some polyurethane rubber, something that you could easily mold a flexible foot. But then again, you've got all the issues of, if your foot is flexible enough to show the dynamic features that are visible in that film, how do you make it also rigid enough to impress deeply into the substrate and propel the individual from one step to the next? It's just it just doesn't hold up. It's funny, one time I did a documentary with a National Geographic channel, I believe it was. I can't remember the name of the program now, but they actually hired an actor and rented a fairly sophisticated costume, one that had made appearances on TV commercials and so forth. And it was a combination of an under armature with foam sculpted musculature sewn into a spandex undersuit, over which then you pulled this four-way stretch costume with fur cloth, and it had a humongous head. It made the head look so big compared to the shoulders and everything. But here's what the kicker was. When I looked at the feet, they were this pair of cheap loafers, like something you might find in a thrift store, with just fur cloth glued to the surface of the shoe, and then the pant leg would just hang over the top, the cuff of the pant leg. There really wasn't any detail in the toes, nothing on the ventral surface, on the plantar surface of the foot. It was laughable. I mean, all the attention was given to the upper part above the ankle, but below the ankle, very little attention was directed, and so it was very unsophisticated. It would never have sufficed to have produced a convincing set of footprints. Even for someone.
After all these years, we have more technology that they're looking at. Have you seen the recent video where they've used AI to clarify some of the footage?
Well, yeah, I participated in that. Well, at least one aspect. We didn't use AI. Well, I'm always a little cautious about the application of AI. What we did, we took multiple scans, or we took scans of multiple copies of varying generations of the film, and then using computer vision algorithms, one of our collaborators, Isaac Tian, was able to overlay these with extraordinary accuracy, and so you get this remarkably dense and resolved, or optimized is the word, not enhanced, because enhancements usually imply some kind of iteration that either averages or creates, through iteration, creates new information. And fills in the gaps. But this wasn't that. It's just that when you have enough copies to account for the idiosyncrasies of copying a film that's on photographic emulsion made up of light sensitive photo grains, not pixels, but grains. So each copy has a slightly different texture, a different pattern of grains. And so that overlay, that superimposition, resulted in this remarkably optimized image that where the idiosyncrasies of individual copies, the scratches and the blemishes of individual copies, or even missing information on a given copy, was all kind of washed out, averaged out, and the overarching image emerges, which is remarkably close to the original. So,
can you see the picture I have on the screen right now?
I do, and yeah, and a word of caution: that one has been, if that's actually, I think, an
This isn't yours.
rendering. Pardon?
This one isn't yours. No.
No, no. It is a kind of an artistic rendering, so there's a little bit of license there, especially when it comes to the nose and mouth.
Mm-hmm.
There's one frame, it's interesting. There's one frame that is making the rounds, or has made the rounds, that is often used for various, as kind of a jumping off point. And its origins are a bit dubious, questionable, because none of the other copies of the film, producing that frame or any other frame, have those particular details, especially around the mouth and the nose, that are kind of the basis for that artistic rendering. And so I think it's a very misleading representation, and unnecessarily so, because I don't think it had these big, bulbous lips and fully downward turning nose. Most of the consensus is the nostrils are a little more forward directed, not as much as the flattened broad nose of a gorilla or a chimpanzee, but yet not the narrow downward facing nose of a Caucasian by any means. The lips tend to, what's interpreted there, there's actually evidence that at one point it was pursing its lips like an ape would do with a muscular mouth, where the lips are being pressed together and the top lip is actually kind of bulging a little bit, as it's got that real intense glare, and the lips are clenched. And then in other places the mouth is more relaxed, the lips actually seem to be parted, although the resolution, that one was quite an elaboration of the mouth area. There's no basis for that whatsoever, unfortunately. But
this is just from the Patterson film. There's still things coming out about it. I don't know if they use this same AI, but there's another video out there where it shows the AI from that video, and they built a big three-dimensional statue, or representation of him, if you will. And the thing they were focusing on was the muscle in the leg, how it was bulging out. Have you seen that one? It's things you've never noticed before, and they have a video that just is talking about the glutamus on this creature.
Sure. Well, again, I would be cautious about any claims of insights arrived at using AI, because the various pictures and portraiture. When you ask AI, you ask an AI program to create I know there was one making the rounds of a Bigfoot combined with Native American features. And so you get all these different kind of iterations, but they're purely imaginative. The AI's has a lot of imagination, is able to generate these notions and then apply the artistic, mechanically artistic rendering of the images in a very very animated fashion, but it's not real. It's not and so the same thing would apply with AI iterations of the Patterson Gimlin film. It's taking what's there as sort of the guardrails, but then what happens in between is pretty wide open to the discretion of the computer program to try to create something that is kind of along those lines. But then to say, here's this revelation, if it's not there, I have, for example, and I've said this over and over again, whenever people try to, they sit and tap their keys on their keyboard and create these supposed enhancements. I have a 5x7 color print that I purchased from Roger Patterson when I was 11 years old, when I joined the Northwest Research Association after having seen the film in the Spokane Coliseum. And that 5x7 color print obviously was made directly from the original film, even before probably other copies of the film had been distributed and so forth. And that photographic, or that photograph, a printed color photograph, is probably about the clearest you could ever arrive at from an image of that film. So you can take that, and I can put it under a dissecting scope in my lab and zoom in on the face, and but it's not going to reveal things that aren't there in the film. So if someone says, well, with this process we were able to resolve individual eyelashes, well, that's baloney. I should be able to, with my dissecting scope, zoom in and see those individual eyelashes if they're really there. But just because you tweak it or you apply some algorithm or some AI that creates an enhancement, that enhancement, if it's adding information that isn't there, then it's not reliable.
Actually, that goes against everything you stand for. You're a scientist looking for legitimate information, but you're looking for the missing information. You're not looking to fill in the gaps of the missing information with something that's not really there.
Well, right. It's just it's distracting from the fundamental objectivity and accuracy of the original data. But even probably more nefarious or insidious, rather, I guess, better word, is that it produces or provides grist for the skeptical mill that this piece of evidence is not being dealt with in an objective, accurate, proper methodological fashion. And so it just becomes detracting and distracting, distracting from the real information and detracting from the credibility of that piece of evidence.
And why would it be created? For popularity? Now, in your case, if someone like me or someone else on the internet comes around and hey, I got this new information. Look, if you do this AI, you can see this bone in the neck. It's different. Why would I do that? I got a video up here, and I got to name this guy because this was disgusting. Bigfoot skull reveal by Brave Wilderness. It was disgusting, where he said he was in Canada. He found a Bigfoot skull. And
yeah, that he pulled out of the ground
the
gorilla skull.
Yeah, and it was obviously a gorilla skull. I'm not an anthropologist, but I could tell because you could see that.
You didn't have to be. It was pretty apparent. And he backpedaled. Again, it made it as if it were some sort of promotional for his upcoming event or this that. But see,
He'd said he did it so people would know, if you ever do find something like this, this is what you should do. You shouldn't touch it. You shouldn't talk about it.
Yeah.
It was
disgusting. That's the problem, I guess, is that it creates this this distraction. It really is distracting from the real.
For you, but more than that, let's talk about your paradigm. All right, as being a doctor of anthropology,
right,
and focusing that on Bigfoot. What is that like for you? What is that like between you and your other colleagues?
Oh, well, sure.
Fame and popularity for it.
No, not well. It kind of depends on who you talk to, but in general, no. That the reaction, the vocal, more public reaction has typically been pretty negative. Although that's changing. You know, we have, I mean, as you point out, I've been at this for a long time, and over that period of time, anthropology hasn't been stagnant. It hasn't stayed in one place, and continuing discoveries and revelations and new ideas, new ways of thinking about the evidence have shifted, literally shifted the paradigm. When I was a student, we were still talking about the influence of the single species hypothesis, it was called. This was the notion that the hominin niche was fairly exclusive. You know, the old ecological principle, one niche, one species. You can't have two species occupying the same niche. They can't do the same thing. One will always be better at it than the other, and either cause one to go species to go to extinction, or force sort of a partitioning of the niche, dividing up the resources or dividing up the way in which resources are utilized. So anthropologists back in the 60s and early 70s were kind of looking for other principles in different scientific disciplines to incorporate, to invigorate their own discipline. And this notion of competitive exclusion of single species per niche was adopted to address the unique aspects of the hominin niche: bipedalism, braininess, and above all, culture, a material culture. And so human evolution was seen as this single file march from one species giving rise to another, being supplanted by a subsequent, and so on. And there could only be one at any given time. So the problem with that, and this was, you know, in full swing in 1967. So when Roger presents his film to the panel at the Smithsonian, they didn't have any place to hang this concept. There were no hooks, because you had just this one lineage and one species at a time. And at the time, we're occupying that niche. So there was no room for another bipedal hominoid. And so they came up with really silly rationales to justify their rejection of the film, and they're quite embarrassing in retrospect, especially. But then shortly thereafter, there was a shift as it became more and more apparent that there were multiple species of hominoid, and, you know, particularly hominin. That tree got bushier and bushier. Finally, there was the acknowledgement that, well, yeah, there were ways in which hominin species could partition that niche. There were different ways to make a living as a bipedal, upright, culture-bearing, to varying degrees, hominin. And so now suddenly, that combined with the fact, add to that the fact that some of these branches have persisted until more recently than we ever would have acknowledged just 30 years ago, then we're left with a situation where now there are cubby holes or hooks on this tree, branches on this tree, where we could hang a label of yeti, of orang pendek, of almas, of Sasquatch, of Yeren. You know, it's the rule rather than the exception throughout geologic time that there have been multiple species of hominin coexisting across the landscape. Why would now be the exception? You know, of course, they come up with rationales. Well, it's our intelligence, our industrial revolution. You know, we've spread out through the globe. We exert influence over, you know, every square meter of the surface of the planet. Basically, it's the argument that what it boils down to. And of course, that doesn't hold up under closer scrutiny very, very well. So that's kind of the backdrop, the anthropological backdrop, the context. The point is that currently there is no reason that there couldn't be species of relic hominoid, of species of upright bipedal hominoids or hominins that have persisted into the present time alongside us in remote corners, or sometimes not so remote corners of the globe, you know, where there is wilderness and you know, fewer human occupants. There's no reason. So, you know, when I was confronted at one time by a colleague who said when a paper was rejected in large measure because of her influence, they can't exist, therefore they don't exist, and it doesn't matter what evidence you think you have. I mean, that not only was that a very inane, unscientific attitude at the time, now even more than then, you can't justify the initial premise that they can't exist. Yes, they can exist. So then the question is, what's the probability that they do exist? How persuasive is the evidence that they exist?
How
And
persuasive is the evidence for you?
what is the evidence?
No, not what is it. How persuasive is it for you?
Oh, well, obviously, I wouldn't have stuck with this and become more and more consumed by it if I wasn't extremely, and if not completely, persuaded. I mean, I'm as confident that they are out there. I mean, I've seen footprints on myself on multiple. I've examined hundreds of casts and hundreds of photographs. I've heard vocalizations. I've had rocks thrown at me. I've had, caught glimpses. I've had things brush against my tent and leave footprints outside my camp. I've had all these experiences and talked to many, many witnesses. It's one thing to read an account and I go through this on a almost daily, if not weekly basis, that where people share their experiences with me, and I have to kind of evaluate vicariously. It's another thing to actually be out there with someone and see the evidence, or to sit there across from them and hear them relate their account, to see how they recall, to where they have
trembling in fear.
Exactly. Physical reaction,
creatures,
retelling of the story. Yeah.
Nice places either. It's like the dark alleys of nature.
Sometimes, but I mean, it's just the vividness of the encounter is so dramatic. That's very compelling. It's then there, when an experienced outdoors person has had an encounter at close range of some significant duration, and that can be 10 seconds to a minute. That's significant when you're actually experiencing it, and under good conditions of observation, daylight. It's pretty presumptuous to say, oh well, you just saw a bear. It's and in some cases, these are people that I've gotten to know, that I'm now close friends with, and I trust them implicitly and their ability to interpret their experience, which is another factor that weighs in the formulation of an opinion about these things. So yeah, it's quite persuasive.
So looking at the scientific evidence through the fossil record, which, I mean, I didn't think about that at the time. I've lived through it, where all of a sudden, oh, there was Neanderthal. Oh, well, this was early human. Oh, wait a second, this wasn't early human. This was another hominid that was in the family that at the same time as the caveman, which, I mean, now it's scientifically proven that it's possible for both to coexist at the same time.
Right.
We have
exactly.
that now.
Yeah. And potentially up until as recently as, in the acknowledged record, I've heard dates as recent as 10,000 years for some of the occupation sites. I think the oldest skeletal remains are somewhere between, 20 and 30,000 years. But still, I mean, that's just a snap of the fingers. And so we clearly occupied, and this is what's so amazing, because then people will often fall back and say, oh, yes, but see, they were interacting, they were hybridizing. Well, that was very limited, and much of it was very early, 160,000 years ago. But they coexisted in Europe side by side for probably, somewhere between 20 and 40,000 years. I mean, I point to myself, European settlers in North America have coexisted with Native Americans for 200 years, and look at the history, what the dynamics of that cohabitation. 40,000 years, and yet at the end of that time, you could still pick up a skull and say, well, this is a modern human anatomy, or alternately, this is a classic Neanderthal. I mean, they still existed distinctly. There hadn't been an absorption, a hybridization that blended the boundaries between the two. So something was keeping them separate from one another for almost 40,000 years of direct contact, sometimes living on the same block, so to speak. They were that close in proximity. So, and who's to say if they didn't survive? I mean, the Russian almas fits the description of the Neanderthal remarkably closely, and their reports, their accounts of encounters with the almas or almasti are within the now recognized range, especially that eastern range of Neanderthals and Neanderthal sites. Myra Shackley, a British archaeologist, who studied the Neanderthal presence in the eastern portions of its range, the mountain ranges up against Mongolia, she reports, showing these stone spear points, these Levallois, the Mousterian cultural points to the locals, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, the Almas make those, or the Almasti, depending on the word, make those. Why are you interested in those?" And she'd say, "Well, who are the Almasti? Oh, they're these backward kind of hillbilly peoples that live up in the mountains. We don't interact with them that much, but sometimes we trade with them, and they describe them and their interactions with them." And Myra was quite intrigued by this and went on to study this aspect, and was one of the first academics to get a paper published on this subject matter in Antiquity, the journal Antiquity, and a peer-reviewed paper, and then subsequently wrote an intriguing book, a very instrumental book, because she could read and translate and summarize much of the Russian literature that addressed research that had been conducted by people like Boris Porzhnev, a Russian cultural anthropologist, that would otherwise have kind of languished in obscurity to us Anglophones who don't have access to those documents. So important contribution. So anyway, it just shows how there are.
I've heard of that before. What year was that? That she wrote the
Oh
paper?
shucks! It came out, I think, when I was in college, so it would have been in the late 70s, early 80s that I think she
I remember
published.
hearing about that, just to show you that there can be another hominoid civilization that lives right across from you in
Right.
the wilderness, if you will.
Yeah.
Is there any information now about them still living?
Well, there are still some reports, although they're very scant. The person who did much of the work, the real field work, was Mary Jean Kaufman, and a lot of her publications, which often came out in sort of semi-technical archaeological journals or magazines in Russian, have been translated and with permission have been reprinted in the journal that I edit, the Relic Hominoid Inquiry. So they're available to people to read about. Great summaries of some of that work, in addition to Myra's book and the books by Dmitry Bayanov and Igor Bortsev, of course, as well. And there's a few others, but the sense is that the reports are much less frequent, and many of the regional investigators and local people say that that they are a thing of the past, that they are no longer around. Whether we would say they're extinct. So they were either on the brink of extinction or so rare now that encounters rarely make their way to the popular popular press. Now, there are reports of things that are very similar to the Sasquatch in some parts of Russia. The Sasquatch-like form has a circum-Pacific distribution, in my estimation, because we have examples of footprints across Asia that are remarkably similar. I mean, one of the most stunning were the footprints that I had the privilege of examining in China, and they were cast by a forest ranger, or park ranger, rather, Mr. Yuan, and remarkable example that, again, corroborates the flexible midfoot model of a flat, flexible foot for the Sasquatch. These tracks are virtually indistinguishable from the titmus cast, for example, or other examples that we have. I don't want to just single out the titmus cast because there are numerous examples that show that mid-tarsal pressure ridge. It's just that's such a dramatic, and that was kind of the jumping off point, the first example. Yeah, there we go. There are Mr. Yuan's casts, and you can see the remarkable similarity in
the middle.
Yeah, and the Patterson's in the middle. The titmus cast from the Patterson-Gimlin film site. And I mean, just the subtleties of the outline. And this individual, its foot length is about the same, a little broader. Maybe it's a young male instead of an adult female that would still be growing. But in any case, one of the things that I collected multiple examples of tracks that were essentially indistinguishable from Sasquatch, from China all the way over to the Caucasus Mountains of Russia, which, you know, if I took that cast and mixed it in amongst a sampling of Sasquatch footprint casts, you know, most people would never bat an eye about trying to single out. You could not single out. I mean, wouldn't bat an eye about including them in the array of examples of Sasquatch tracks. What I was trying to get to, the thing that strikes me as really quite interesting about all this is an example I've told before, but I was reading an article that was addressing the imperiled status of Asian tigers, and the map graphic just jumped off the page at me because it showed a map of Asia with the historic range of the tigers highlighted in you know, pale orange, and then inset within were these more restricted islands of habitat, you know, indicated in bright red, that showed the present distribution of Asian tigers. What jumped out at me was I immediately recognized that these multiple examples from China, from Vietnam, from Nepal, from the Caucasus and other places, all corresponded to these now fragmented refugia of the tiger, meaning that there was an ecological. Now, in this case, you know, people are not mistaking tiger sightings for an upright bipedal hominin, you know, like sometimes is said about black bears and Sasquatch in North America. But what it does say is that there's an ecological correlation. There's a basis for the current distribution of these Sasquatch-like creatures that have an old world distribution and then expanded their range into North America, as did so many other mammal groups at various times.
It follows the ecology.
Yeah. Exactly. It's similar habitat for these two species, and so the distribution correlates with one another remarkably parallel.
I've got this right here, and I know you know this, man. Right here. Oh, here we go. These are, what do you call it? A demonstration of the Bigfoot sightings that have been reported. Maybe I can put it, you guys can see it better. I'll put a link to all the pictures I'm showing in the show notes. That's a lot of people that see Bigfoot for anybody to not believe.
Right. And you have to be a little cautious because some of those databases include things other than footprints or sightings. They might include suspicious vocalizations or tree knocks or tree structures. I can't speak for this particular example because I don't remember off the top of my head the basis for including the various reports. But sometimes, and quite frequently, I should say, not just sometimes, but quite frequently, documentaries will state that Bigfoot's been sighted in every state in the Union, or there have been reports of Bigfoot from every state in the Union. Well, yes, there might be reports. That doesn't mean that Bigfoot exists in every state in the Union. So, if you live in the wheat fields of Kansas or the cornfields of Iowa, the chances are there are not Bigfoot living there. But it does speak, as you point out, to the pervasiveness of in the appropriate habitats, and you can see how they tend to line up with montane forest habitats and some bottomlands too, but dense forest. These are, after all, wild men of the woods, right? Not wild men of the prairie or wild men of the Arctic. They're wild men of the woods. So
I'm about to open up the phone line so you guys can ask Dr. Meldrum some questions. Phone number is, let me see the phone number. I'll put the banner up here for you guys. Phone number is right up here. 325-261-0892. So you guys can call in on the second half of the show. I have a question for you. You are one of the experts, if not the experts, on Bigfoot. In your opinion, and if you can't answer this question, that's fine. Or if you don't want to, not that you don't have the ability to, but is there information about Bigfoot being kept from the public? I see this graphic, and I think there has to be some information that's 100% solid. Yes, here's the body, but somebody in the government, or I don't know, a scientist, perhaps the Smithsonian, I don't know, won't let that information get out. Does that exist?
Well, it's possible. You never say never, I guess. But and I don't have firsthand experience with that. My experience has always been at the sort of middle management level of government agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, State Fish and Game, the U.S. Forest Service. And in dealing with those people, and even other corporate, like forestry conglomerates or corporations or whatever, companies, my experience has been that it is driven by personality, not by policy. That is, you'll have an administrator or supervisor, whatever, who is very sensitive to their own reputation and any perception of inappropriate behavior or the mishandling of public funds.
I've heard about that.
Yeah.
Colleagues got in trouble for
John Myanzinski was with the Wyoming Game and Fish at the time, and they had been directed to investigate what was behind a flap of reports about Bigfoot encounters. The supervisor was concerned that if there was someone in a fursuit, there were people. This has gotten enough publicity. There were people showing up, coming to his office, asking where could they look for the Sasquatch to shoot. So he thought, if someone's traipsing around in a costume, I don't want someone to get shot on his watch. On the other hand, he said, if there is an 800-pound gorilla prowling in the woods that might pose a threat to people on state lands, then state and public lands, then he wanted to know about it. So
if the Bigfoot they move according to ecology, I don't know, maybe it has something to do with mating season, and there's some times of the year where it's dangerous to be out in a particular area. You'd want to know.
That's possible. It's possible. Yeah. I mean, you always have to have deference for an animal of that size, and if you, it's just like with bears. For the most part, you're usually okay, but especially if you get between a sow and her cubs, obviously. So if you get between a mother and offspring, or between a guy and his dinner, then who knows what the outcome could be. And so there's always concern. One should always use deference with any large wild animal.
Could
But
be hard.
that's always been kind of my experience. I've never seen any evidence of any higher authorities. In fact, they're often oblivious of
Yeah,
what's taking place down here, because these people never reported up the chain of command, because they don't want any stigma or any retribution, or they don't want to put themselves in a compromising position, so they never talk about it.
that makes sense. That makes absolute sense. That
Yeah.
solved it in my mind. I also want to talk about, yeah, I could talk to you for hours about hybrid DNA. I heard you say one time, without any elaboration, that it exists in nature, or it's existed in nature at certain times and in certain areas, hybridization between animals.
Sure. Well, sure. There is that phenomenon. I mean, the whole process of speciation is this process of bifurcation of lineages that which become distinct as their respective gene pools are more isolated. The thing that glues a population together is the free flow of genes. And if you restrict that free flow, then those two gene pools begin to evolve independently of one another, and may alter to the point that then they can no longer interbreed when they come back into contact, and you have successful speciation. So closely related species still often have some capacity for hybridization, and many closely related species have hybrid zones where the two species are in contact, and there is occasional introgression of genes between the two. So when it comes to Sasquatch, we have no confirmed, credible confirmation of any DNA samples. We just don't. There have been some samples that we were hopeful, but they come back from the very superficial examinations that usually are all that is afforded on that occasion. So a very small sample of sequence, or part of a single gene, usually the mitochondrial gene, which sometimes are less discriminating than would a gene from the nucleus of the cell be, and they come back as human, and that's usually explained as either contamination from mishandling, or simply a misidentified human specimen like a hair.
Hmm.
The third possibility that I've always pointed to was um, the fact that we're dealing with two species that are so closely related, even more closely than humans and chimps. We may be talking about 0.5%, 1/4 of 1%. And
Wow.
so you have to sequence a lot of material in order to find those very rare and dispersed markers that would distinguish them from us. So that raises the question of a third possibility. Since we're so closely related, is there any hybridization taking place? This has been proposed and suggested as the explanation for some of the results, but like I said, there have been no credible results. There is a very interesting paper I would like it to direct your listeners to, because
I'll do
I
it.
find it is a fascinating possibility that addresses some of this. And it was a hypothesis that was spawned or was explored by an individual who, well, let's just say he had a real interest in this, and was uh, motivated to explore it. And so he got into the literature and looked, and he actually found examples of what is called mitochondrial introgression, where some of your listeners may be aware that the mitochondrial genome is inherited strictly matrilineally through the female line. I mean, so all of your,
Minute also.
excuse me?
Isn't it very minute?
Oh no, it's very numerous. So the mitochondria are I mean, by comparison to the nuclear genome, it's much smaller, if that's what you mean. Yeah. But I mean, it's more numerous in the cell because there are multiple copies, because the mitochondria are these little powerhouses, we like to call them, that produce ATP, which is sort of the energy currency of the cell, adenosine triphosphate. And so there are lots of these, and all of those in each cell in your body came originally from your mother's egg. Your father's sperm contributed just the genetic material without any mitochondria, just the nuclear genetic material. And so, in any case, but the point is, the short story of this is that there is a scenario where, through limited successful matings, hybrid matings between human and Sasquatch, that there could, if the offspring stayed with the Sasquatch population, a female offspring, and survived to maturity and reproduced, she would have human, if it's a human female and a male Sasquatch, she would have human mitochondrial genes. And if those, through the serendipity of what we call the lucky lineage, became dominant, introgressed into the Sasquatch population, then it might become common. And if you had a hair that was legitimately from a Sasquatch, and you successfully got DNA, and because of limited funding and so forth, you contracted a very superficial mitochondrial gene analysis, guess what? That mitochondrial gene is human, because it came from the human mother, and your result would be human.
It seems like it would almost be impossible to have sexy time with a Sasquatch. That would be about sexy time with a Kodak bear.
There's anecdotal evidence. There are Native American stories, and these are repeated. They're not isolated and singular. I mean, they're rare. These would be very rare events, but the parallels are remarkably similar. Where in these cases, the offspring weren't left in the custody of the Sasquatch population, if you will. It's hard to imagine the scenarios, but it's not too hard. I mean, it's feasible. But the point is, in these cases, the two cases that I'm familiar with, one that was reported in Rob Alley's book, and another that I had some firsthand interaction with a witness to the event, or at least to the consequence.
The event of a mating with the Sasquatch?
Well, no, there was a story. There was a story of an Indian maiden who was abducted, disappeared. She vanished, was gone for months on end, and then when she returned, she was pregnant, and she claimed she had been abducted by one of these hairy men, these hairy giants, and had become impregnated by it. She gave birth. Well, there was great discussion amongst the tribe as to whether the birth should be permitted to go to culmination or not. It was eventually decided yes, but that she would go into isolation with relatives out of the state. And then she reportedly gave birth. The infant survived. It grew rapidly. It was quite strong, physically strong, but unhealthy. It was sickly, always getting sick, had respiratory issues and so forth. And it died in its early teens, and was buried in that location out of state. I won't give any other details, but what was interesting is this was recounted by the girlfriend of the girl who was abducted to one of my colleagues, and he was privy to the details of it. What then was really uncanny was we were actually doing a shoot with interviews of local people of interest, in an out-of-state area, the area where this girl supposedly was put in isolation with relatives. And out of the blue, I'm sitting there having a conversation with this indigenous gentleman, and he said, "What you guys really should do is go up here, the cemetery up on the hill. There's one buried up there." I'm going, "What?" He said, "Yeah, there." And then he recounts this story. This girl shows up from out of state, and she'd supposedly been impregnated by a Sasquatch and was here with relatives. And then he described, she gave birth, it grew fast, it was strong but sick, and it died when it was, it was actually left with abandoned and left with the priest, and was buried in the church cemetery when it passed away when it was about 12. And I'm going, this is the same story, only from the other end of the I mean, it really corroborated the story.
What decade was this happened in? What decade was it?
This would have been, well, it would have taken place. The girlfriend was still alive about 20 years ago. And so it would have been back in the, probably back in the 60s or 70s that it took place. But, and then, like I said, Rob Alley has a similar native account, and there have been others, but
so it's possible. It would be possible.
Oh yeah, it's possible. It's possible. I mean, there are accounts of rape in between humans and other great apes. The genetics are such, different chromosome numbers, that it often leads to a non-viable. If there is a pregnancy, I mean, even if there is a pregnancy, and that's part of the problem. See, there were supposedly all these stories about World War II secret programs trying to create super soldiers by crossing ape genes with human genes, creating some kind of hybrid, or at least genetically enhanced or altered soldiers. But the problem is, there are, you can't just have an egg and any old sperm, and if they're brought into proximity, fertilization takes place. There are recognition proteins that provide additional barriers between species. This is part of nature. We would have nothing but chaos if everything could cross and create fertile offspring. But that's one of the mechanisms to ensure these boundaries, is that even if other barriers are crossed and the gametes come into proximity, they have to be able to recognize one another in order for fertilization to take place. And so my understanding is that chimp and human sperm differ in those proteins, and so it would require genetic in vitro manipulation.
I have a few questions from the audience here.
After that conversation,
oh man, I could talk about the hybrid part, and about the hybrid in nature, and about somebody was saying that the Neanderthals and the humans, got together too.
Oh yeah, and this is a phenomenon that has taken on new import in discussions of human paleoanthropology, human evolution. That is that now that we have the Human Genome Project, now that we've sequenced the human genome, we've sequenced Neanderthal genomes, they've recognized, and Denisovans and so forth, they've recognized that most modern Homo sapiens carry quite a number of Neanderthal genes. But in my earlier comments, I was just trying to emphasize that it wasn't as if there was rampant free love between Neanderthals, and that these were rather rare events. And the evidence also suggests a one-way flow. They have not identified yet any human any uniquely modern human genes in the Neanderthal sequences. So it's just Neanderthals and modern humans. So that would suggest, because in most scenarios, the infant is going to stay with the mother, right? So in that case, it would be the human female crossing with a Neanderthal male rather than vice versa. At least there's no surviving. Yeah, at least there's no surviving.
A Bigfoot hunting trip.
Yeah.
6-pack of beer.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can kind of imagine scenarios of that. But anyway.
And if he is, he wouldn't talked about it. So talking about DNA, well, okay, hold on. Before I talk about that, someone's question is, where in North America are you confident there are Bigfoot now or in the past?
Right. Well, the rule of thumb, the kind of axiom that I offer as just a starting point for that conversation, springs from the recognition, and there's been a published study, an editorial, where they examined Sasquatch reports, and they did comparison between the factors that determine black bear habitat with the distribution of Bigfoot reports, and found just a remarkable correlation. So, and it does, no surprise, you have two large omnivorous species, mammal species, so they have similar requirements. But again, going back to our principle of competitive exclusion, they are going about being omnivores in different ways, different activity patterns, different chewing morphologies, different gut physiology, and so forth. But so the rule of thumb is, look at the distribution of black bear across North America today. And there's some great maps. You can, if you Google online black bear distribution map, you'll, American black bear, they'll pop up immediately. And use that kind of as a jumping off point, because then you could say, well, if a black bear can make a living, then perhaps a Sasquatch could as well. And also look at the density. The distribution is one aspect, but how many black bear are supported in that habitat? And there's great summary articles. If you look up black bear numbers by state and Google, there's a great article that has all 50 states listed and what the estimate is if those data are available. A couple states that don't report that. But, Idaho, for example, has 35,000 black bear. But you go over to Florida, where I just spoke recently, they have 4,000 black bear. So there is some habitat, but it doesn't support a large population of black bears. Now, the inverse is also interesting. And if there aren't black bear, like in the middle of the wheat fields of Kansas, the chances of there being a Sasquatch, if there aren't the resources to support a black bear population today, the cover, the habitat, the food resources, water, etc., limited human encroachment and whatnot, then that says something about the potential for a Sasquatch to be.
If you don't find a Sasquatch, you're at least going to find yourself a bear.
Yeah, much more likely. And then another thing is with those numbers of black bear, there's an exercise, and I won't go through the whole thing because it's part of an hour presentation about Sasquatch behavioral ecology that I give, but I kind of walk through a way to, based on a number of different clues, about coming to an estimate of how many Sasquatch are there in a given state, for example, and based it on a lot of different variables. But what's amazing is that when you do this exercise, the outcome is remarkably consistent across different states, and the ratio. Again, this is just rule. This is sort of ballpark. This is spitballing against the wall for the sake of discussion. And I could be proven wrong, and there's going to be a lot of variation. But 1 to 200 black bear for every single Sasquatch in a given state. So 35,000 black bear in Idaho. There's 100 and 150 to or 170 to 350-ish Sasquatch. In Florida, with 4,000, there's only 40 to what would that be? 4,000. There would be 40 to 20 to 40 in all the state.
So does that correlate with the sightings?
Well, not entirely, because this is the problem with these kinds of data, like you have up there now, is that these are not collected systematically. These are volunteered reports of witnesses, and for there to be a data point, there has to be a person involved. There has to be a person that has found tracks or seen something or heard something. And so it's not like when like they would do with black bear and do a systematic survey, or account, by tagging and baiting and observing and marking and so forth. So it doesn't necessarily, where there are more people adjacent to Sasquatch habitat, then there potentially are a disproportionate number of encounters. If the culture is such that people are more inclined to post their experience on social media or on one of these databases, then you get more reports. I was just going to say, for the longest time, Idahoans were notoriously close vests, close, tight-lipped, played it close to the vest and didn't report these. Even now, you go to, say, the BFRO's database and look at Idaho, and it doesn't reflect my experience with eyewitnesses. And I don't spend a lot of my time. I don't think it's the high priority for my time to chase down and try to verify, as to their credit, the BFRO curators do. So I don't do that, but I can gauge just from my own experiences and from other investigators here in Idaho. Becky Cook, for example, has written a whole series of books. Bigfoot lives in Idaho. Bigfoot still lives in Idaho, and so forth. But lots and lots of accounts, most of which are not in the BFRO database, for example. So it's messy. It's messy data. You always have to look at these things kind of as real ballpark approximations, just as jumping off points. And then you've got to, if you're motivated to do your own research, you use these different insights, these different factors to try to narrow down some potential places to look, and then you just keep working those places. You got to become familiar, but bear in mind, it's like winning the lottery. The odds are really, really low.
Where would the odds be better for finding Sasquatch or winning the lottery?
Yeah, I think winning the lottery, quite honestly, for most people. But the point is, just like they say, you're not going to win the lottery if you don't buy lottery tickets. So if you don't go out there and spend time in the field, hike and camp and train yourself to recognize sign that might be right under your nose, you'll never have those experiences. You got to get out there and do it.
1 in 50 million chance of seeing a Sasquatch, but a 1 in 200 chance of getting a black bear.
Oh, right. Yeah. So, and even there, see, that's the thing. Given those numbers, when you reflect on 35,000 black bear in Idaho, yet you talk to lots of outdoors people, and it's a once in a lifetime experience to bump into a black bear. I mean, there's
that's so interesting right there. It's that kind of experience to run to a black bear. And what about a black bear's carcass? How often is that found in nature? And this brings up this question from our audience here.
Yep.
How do you feel they take care of their dead? Do they do burial? Has anyone ever located the remains?
No. Well, no, not credibly. There've been a couple. There was one. I just went blank on his name. Michael Rugg. Michael Rugg was a witness brought in a tooth, and unfortunately, it's been destroyed. But a mold was made of it. We've got a model of it, but it was completely consumed in an effort to try to get DNA from it. Not by me, but by another person. But what was uncanny We've never quite followed through because the wear was so extensive that, it was, the crown was worn down, so the distinguishing features are kind of lost. But as far as the shape and size and proportion, you put it up to that one of those two jaws associated with Gigantopithecus blacki, and it's a dead ringer for one of the premolars on that jaw. That raises kind of an interesting possibility. But other than that tantalizing little bit, no, nothing. Now, I don't think that they do take care of their dead. Everything points to these creatures being solitary. Yeah, that's not a Sasquatch tooth. Yeah, I don't know what the deal was with that. I did remember looking into that, but it's really odd. But anyway,
pictures of Mike Rugg, but not his tooth that he found.
yeah. Oh, that's Mike Rugg's hand?
No.
Oh.
I have pictures of Mike Rugg, but not.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, like I said, it's a pretty featureless tooth that doesn't. The crown is worn down to the point that there aren't many distinguishing characteristics. Yeah. So anyway, back to your point or the question. Everything points to these creatures being rather solitary. Tracks are of single individuals. Most sightings are single individuals, or what might be a female with offspring.
Okay, hold on.
And so,
Midnight Radio, this is Jerry and Dr. Meldrum. Do you have a comment or question for the doctor? Oh, and they hung up on us. I'm sorry, doctor. Go ahead.
That's all right. Well, I was just going to say that in situations like that, usually there isn't any concern over the demise of one of their species if they're even aware of it, because an animal like that, when it gets old and decrepit and death is at the doorstep, they'll often hide away or secrete themselves in some out of the way nook or cranny and not visible generally. And so when they die, their body is quickly rendered by principles of decomposition, by the decayers and decomposers and the scavengers that come along. And nature disposes of those kinds of things really, really quickly. I sometimes would show my students a time-lapse movie where they set up a camera on a elephant carcass of a poached elephant that had been killed, and within 2 weeks there wasn't even a grease spot in the dirt. I mean, the whole elephant was gone, completely carted off, and every bone, every scrap. So an animal of that dimension, and of course there's a lot of animals, there are a lot of creatures and so forth on the African veldt there to carry out that duty. But in the wet coniferous forest, the soils are very acidic. So what the decomposers and scavengers don't eat or chew or gnaw, all the rodents and other creatures. I mean, even deer chew on bone for calcium. But then anything exposed to the elements in that acidic environment quickly deteriorates and decomposes and just doesn't leave anything. I mean, think for a minute, the comparison to, since we mentioned Gigantopithecus, here's a giant ape of this size proportion that inhabited a subtropical to temperate forested habitat, very likely.
Midnight Radio, this is Jerry and Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Do you have a comment or question for the good doctor?
Hey, yeah, this is David. How you doing?
We're doing well.
Yeah, I just was. He kind of touched on one of my questions already, which was the people always ask, why don't we find the Bigfoot bones or the bodies? And he kind of explained that about the black bears. If you've got a population of black bears, which is hundreds of thousands more than the Bigfoot, and how often do you find one of those, a black bear that died from natural causes? It gives you kind of an insight into the chances, because the numbers are so much lower. What would be the chances of ever finding anything like that. I think he was just kind of explaining the elephant and how fast things disappear
Right.
in the forest. So I was going to ask him also. Oh, go ahead.
No,
I'm
you
sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sitting here with a couple of books that came in. One of them I've posted a few things about. This is a guy named Mitchell N. Townsend, and he's a accredited kind of professor type. Does papers and studies and that sort of thing. And he has these papers. He claims that they are peer reviewed, and he's figured this out by he's found bones of elk and deer that were chewed on, and they found the tracks of the Bigfoot in a place where they sat down, and the bones were scattered out into like a cone-shaped pattern, just like somebody was sitting there eating ribs on a Saturday, and they measured the distance between the teeth on the scrapings. It's really quite amazing. I'm still reading through the book. I've only got it about a third of the way through it, but I was just wondering if he's seen those papers, if he has an opinion on those.
Well, I've met Mr. Townsend, and I didn't realize he had managed to publish a book. Is it self-published, I assume?
It could be, yeah. It's let me look at the ISDN, see if it's
Maybe
got
Amazon Publishing, maybe.
a number.
Yeah. Well,
it's ISBN 13.978-153-988-3203. I guess I could email that to
that's fine. That's fine. No. At the time I first met Michael Townsend, he claimed his paper was in peer review. I actually was asked to read it and review it for him prior to that whole process, and I had a lot of concerns and critiques to offer that just were not addressed, were not sufficiently explained or illustrated in his manuscript to back up his claims. To my knowledge, that paper has never been published, at least not in a reputable peer-reviewed journal. So I know of no paper, let alone multiple papers. He is not he's not even an adjunct. He's not a professor. He doesn't have a Ph.D. is my understanding. Doesn't have a Ph.D. He's not an adjunct faculty. He was given permission to teach a night course, which he did about Bigfoot, kind of just as a special interest topic. But it's I don't mean to I do. I guess I do mean to qualify his statements, not by casting dispersions or speaking ill of him, but he has a tendency to misrepresent his credentials, and not only his academic, but his military credentials, from what I've been told by other individuals in the know in that regard. So the claims about the ribs and the chew marks, he can't demonstrate that these are not rodents. There's a big deal about the little, he draws attention to, and I can't remember the particular name, the little papillary bumps on a newly erupted permanent tooth. Before the tooth wears nice and even, there's often these little rounded bumps on the edge. And he suggests that there's evidence of that in the stripping of the membrane of the periosteum from the ribs. There's no evidence offered in the paper of stacking in any intentional way. The photo that's provided just shows bones that are randomly scattered down a hillside. Just a natural scattering of bones at a decomposing, processing site of a carcass. It's just, one thing after another. There just frankly is no substance. He was going, the last time I saw him, at a conference, he was going on and on and on about these stones that were supposedly painted by Native Americans, and the paintings, he found examples that depicted the Sasquatch or a hairy man. But when you look at them, when you examine them, they are simply patina, natural patina on these stones. There's nothing painted, manually painted on. He looked through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these in a natural quarry or an old riverbed or something, but until he and then cherry picked out examples of Sasquatch and supposedly other figures that are so abstract. I mean, it's like a Rorschach ink blot test. There's nothing to that whatsoever. I don't know if that has figured, but I see that every now and again he gets invited to present at a conference here or there. I was talking with one organizer, and he was really lobbying hard and heavy to try to get an invitation from this individual to include him in the program. I'll let what he has to say speak for itself, but it would be interesting to see the book. I can't imagine that there's anything more substantial than what was in the manuscript, because I gave him a whole list of ways in which he could improve his manuscript to at least get a peer review, serious peer review, things that would be necessary for him even to submit it to the Relic Hominoid inquiry for consideration. And he didn't address any of them, not a single point of my review. And so I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of these pictures. Yeah, I see the picture now where he's got the teenager Bigfoot with the bumps on his teeth. I guess that's over my head, a lot of it, but it's just interesting. He does get a little bit off on the what they call the woo-woo side of things. He takes people out to the site and they see all these lights and orbs and stuff. And
yeah,
so I think I just finish reading the book and see more what I think about it. But he claims that the teeth distance is the exact ratio. There's a certain ratio, this number he's hung on.
Right. I know. And he cites some person who claims credentials in and I can't remember the exact term, but this concocted discipline of dental morphology, which doesn't exist. And so this guy if he's a real person, he's a hack, or more likely he only exists in Michael's imagination. It's just a character, authoritative character that he has created in order to lend some credibility to his theory about these impressions on the teeth. But anyway, next.
That's Professor David. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you for calling in. Appreciate it. You have a good evening.
Hey, thank you. Good luck, Dr. Jeff.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right. He brought up something. Well, I guess he sort of did. Here's a question from the audience. Any indication of supernatural abilities or hostility towards humans or Indian depictions?
Well, for the most part, it's always funny because I had to catch myself, because for the most part, descriptions of encounters with Sasquatch are really quite mundane. And usually the witness and Sasquatch end up very promptly going in opposite directions. Having said that, there is an element of both European but also indigenous tradition that is a little more nefarious, whether it's abducting adults or abducting children. The aspects of, quote, cannibalism in the sense of man-eating because of their man-like qualities. I guess the term cannibal has been attached, but eating humans, which seems kind of just so stories. And yet there is precedent in great ape behavior There was a rash of abductions of human children during the extremely harsh drought conditions in Uganda, for example, that got some publicity and some press coverage. Over a 7-month period, one particular 7-month period, there were 12 cases of human toddlers and infants being snatched by chimps and eaten. So suddenly these just so stories about Sasquatch snatching native children and taking them off to eat for dinner, like Hansel and Gretel, have a basis in biological behavior of other great apes. So there's that part. As far as supernatural, I don't think nothing that I'm familiar in their anatomy and behaviors speaks to any supernatural or paranormal qualities. It just doesn't. Every time I've been included in some outing in an effort to demonstrate to me some paranormal experience, nothing happens. It's suddenly
think they're dimensional supernatural beings because they don't readily see them.
Well, right. Yeah, I know. And so that's what I find is when people get frustrated because they haven't won the lottery, they come up with different explanations to account for their lack of success. And so not all, and there's some who have genuine experiences from their perspective, their own subjective interpretation of what has happened. And I respect that, and I'm open, certainly open to the possibility, but there is, because I've encountered and interacted with these people, there is an element that resort or gravitate to those explanations because they find the naturalistic ones wanting. If they were just flesh and blood, we would have caught one by now. If they were just flesh and blood, we would have found a body by now. But see, I don't find a problem in those objections. The phenomenon. I mean, the rarity is the common denominator that, in my mind, accounts for those shortcomings.
This is a question, and I believe you answered it before, but it was primarily, it's been on my mind since I even heard the name Sasquatch, and I was wondering, okay, well, where are the dead bodies? Where are the bones? And the second thing is, where's the poo-poo? Where is the scat? And that recently, I have a picture. It was right beside yours when I was looking you up, although it was David Pilates, though it wasn't you. True story. Here it is, right here. I was wondering if you had a big one like this.
Oh,
huge.
I don't have one like that. No.
Have you seen this? Have you heard about this?
No, not that particular example, but
have you seen examples of this before? It looks like it's on his book.
Well, sure. I've seen examples of scat that could very well. I mean, the best one that comes to mind. I was working with Don Myanzinski. We had kind of reached out and tried to network with the agency offices throughout Western Wyoming, where we were doing a lot of field work in order to open the channels of communication. And sure enough, a couple of weeks later, we'd get a call, and there had been footprints found in the southern end of the Wind River Range.
Oh, wow.
And these were some of the best footprints I've ever seen. 16-inch tracks. It came down out of the woods, was meandering in amongst a cluster of seasonally occupied cabins. It was peering in the kitchen windows, I can just imagine. But in any case, they found the tracks. The residents found the tracks the next morning. And sure enough, as I've often hoped for, there was a scat right between two footprints, just right there. And unfortunately, it was quite a number of days before we were, between being notified and being able to get out there to examine and collect it. And when it was, you have about an 8-hour window with scat to get it stabilized, preserved in 95% ethanol in order to get any DNA from it. Otherwise, bacterial action in the scat itself just, chews up all that DNA from the sloughed mucosal cells. And so that was kind of out of the question. But we had a documentary crew that was more than willing to pay for the test. So we thought, oh, what the heck? You know, it's a shot in the dark, but maybe there might be some trace that has survived. It came back as dog. Well, we thought this is ridiculous. It's not dog scat because you could break it open and see the contents, and it was almost 100% well masticated but not completely digested sedges. Dogs don't eat sedges. At least they might chew on some grass, you know, when they have indigestion, but they won't sit and eat a stomach full of sedges from a marsh or a meadow. But we discovered upon then questioning the witnesses, the family, he goes, oh yeah, my dog, as soon as he saw it, he came over and sniffed, he lifted his leg and peed all over it.
Oh.
So we were picking up traces of that dog urine on the scat, on the scat. So anyway,
if they were doing a DNA test and they had something they didn't recognize, and then they had dog DNA, would they just go with, okay, it's dog?
Well, there's that possibility too. Sure, you might just take the simplest, most straightforward result. But one of the challenges with this is, on a slightly different vein, is again we talked about black bear and Sasquatch, two large omnivores, meaning they have similar or at least overlapping diets, and so and they have quite varied diets. So the appearance of bear scat and Sasquatch scat could be fairly similar, especially if their body mass is comparable. Then the size and volume could be very comparable as well. And the consistency is going to depend on what they've been eating. So like in this case, it was like manure. I mean, it was formed more in a cylindrical shape rather than like a cow pie, but it was long logs of compacted sedges. If they've been eating berries, it's going to look like berry cobbler. You know, it's a big mush, big gush pop. And if they get into a carcass, then it's black. You know, so it varies with the season, with the foods that are dominant in their digestive tract, and how well it's digested. So when you say where is the poop, I suspect that most poop is just no one gives another thought because it just looked like bear scat.
Dr. Meldrum, look at this scientifically. So instead of going out and looking for Sasquatch, I mean, astronomical odds.
Yeah.
How about looking for his poop? I mean, that's even more astronomical, it seems like.
Good question. Well, no, it's a good question, and we tackled it. I mean, it's not like I haven't thought of these things. And there are specially trained scat dogs that are used in various conservation wildlife studies. They are trained to identify the scat of specific species, and they can even be trained to identify individuals within that species in a given region. Sometimes it's just remarkable what they do. So of course we began to explore this. We talked to several cadaver dog and scat dog handlers, and we had one that was really intrigued with this whole question, and she even offered to, with a little bit of financial support, because it's a huge commitment to take on a dog and train it. You know, you have that dog for the next 20 years. So, and I have access to various tissues of great apes in my collection, some that are fresh frozen. So I was able to get gorilla and chimp and orangutan. But then in talking, and so she was actually working with the dog, training it on these specimens. But then talking with other trainers, they were very negative because they said these dogs are so specific. I mean, these are dogs, like I said, who can pick out individuals. These are dogs that can be trained to detect changes in your body that suggest cancer or diabetes, you know. There's that sensitive. And she says if you train them to orangutan, thinking that, well, the Bigfoot's got to be closely related to orangutan or chimp, it will indicate to orangutan, but it won't recognize Sasquatch as an orangutan. You know, just like it won't recognize the chimp as an orangutan or a human as an orangutan. She said, so you're basically going to train a dog to something that it will never encounter in the wild. And then plus, she said, with these scat dogs, they have to be constantly ongoing training, and they have to be successful. They have to be positively reinforced. So if you can't go out there and have it successfully find scat on a regular basis, you're going to lose its, you know, any training capabilities that are instilled within the dog. So it fizzled, and it was obvious that it wasn't going to work. And then unfortunately, our trainer took a job elsewhere, and her dog became a pet. I don't know if it went on to be trained in other things besides great apes or not.
I've learned a lot about Sasquatch scat that I never thought I would. It all makes sense to me now. I mean, if you need this verified, and you're sure you're not playing around, this isn't a joke, but it's like, hey, I've got something, Dr. Meldrum.
Yeah.
When he comes out there and he sees the feet, he's like, that is the footprint of Sasquatch. That has to be the poop of Sasquatch. It makes sense. You can actually verify the poop.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've told this story before, but you know, people were eager to send me their specimens collected in the field, and some would send frozen scat in August. Well, you know, if it's not FedEx Overnight Express, it's probably going to thaw out before it arrives in Pocatello. And I've had occasion when the secretary calls me and said, Dr. Meldrum, there's a box down here for you, and it's dripping, and it doesn't smell very good.
Oh.
So I had to request, you know, people generally don't send me anything unless, you know, it's completely either air dried. If it's beyond DNA analysis, then it needs to be air dried. You know, you put it in a lunch bag and just let it completely dry out until it's can be crumbled. There's no moisture left, and then you can break it apart. You can re-elute it with some water under a microscope and look at the vegetation. What is it eating? What parasites might be present? You know, look for eggs under the microscope and so forth. And but otherwise, if you find scat and it's still, and that's why I say, if it's steaming and it's between two tracks, then I encourage people to, you know, take a little vial, and if you can get a hold of some 95% ethanol, that's ideal. Sometimes that's hard to come by, but unless you have access to a stock room at a university or whatnot, then you can use isopropyl alcohol, rubbing alcohol. It's just not as good. But have a little vial with alcohol, and then I say, you know, just go down to one of these fast food stores and get a little cellophane wrapped knife or spoon. Have that in your backpack, and then a pair of gloves. Break the seal. Just skim off the outside of the scat, because that's, as it passes down through the anal canal, it scrapes off some of the mucosal cells lining the intestine, and then the outer kind of shiny layer, mucousy looking layer on that scat is where the Sasquatch DNA would be. You get that and you swirl it down into that isopropyl alcohol, seal it up, and then there's a chance. I mean, but see,
give everybody instructions of how to mail you, the proper way to mail you Sasquatch poo.
But you have to be pretty confident, because it's expensive to have DNA analysis done.
You believer.
And as we've talked about earlier, you can't be satisfied with just a cursory analysis of a single, you know, short span of DNA. You're going to have to do an extensive. So we're talking potentially tens of thousands of dollars to have it.
Does it need to be frozen within 8 hours of being excreted?
Well, ideally, it's not just frozen, but ideally it's put into alcohol. That will stabilize the DNA so it doesn't decompose. Even freezing, unless you have an ultra cold freezer. See, most frost-free freezers in people's homes, the way they stay frost-free is they cycle up. They warm up so that so the frost doesn't accumulate and turn into a glacier in there, and so the temperature is vacillating significantly, and a specimen, a biological specimen like that's not going to be stable.
All right. So isopropyl alcohol, 90 proof. No, not isopropyl. You said ethanol.
Yeah, ideally 95% ethanol.
95% ethanol. I'm going to put that in the show notes below. I might make a short clip of it of what to do with Sasquatch. So,
Yeah.
all right. We're coming to the end of the show now. We got 10 minutes left. I got a couple more questions.
Okay.
Somebody wants to know what you have coming up on the horizon. What are you working on now?
Right. That's a good question. Oh, and I just wanted to put a plug in for, you were talking about putting notes. Check out my Sasquatch field guide. A lot of the questions about field techniques for collecting and documenting and preserving and reporting, so forth, of different types of data, different types of evidence are explained very nicely and succinctly in that little laminated multifold field guide. So the future, well, I was very excited pre-pandemic with a project that we were trying to mount in collaboration with Dr. Neil Gemmell of New Zealand, who's a molecular biologist. He was one of the principal investigators of the multinational team that looked at the waters of Loch Ness using environmental DNA techniques to identify the inhabitants of that and of the lake and its surrounding environment. And they came up with this very interesting conclusion of this previously unrecognized eel species, suggesting that maybe there's a giant eel that is harbored or the lake harbors. So, make a long story short, I met a former student of his who got us in communication with one another. It turns out he would be is interested in mounting a project to apply these kinds of techniques to the search for Sasquatch. And then, unfortunately, the pandemic hit. Travel was shut down, and everything it took the wind out of the sails of the project. And now we are past or post pandemic, but still it's been a little bit challenging getting the head of steam built up again. So that's one of on my to-do list for this summer, is to start to get our ducks back in a row for that project, with aims of perhaps 2024 being the thrust of that. The other direction, well, I mean, there's other directions for field research. This one, environmental DNA, I think is probably the most promising. As far as other projects, one that I'm also very excited about is that Doug Hychek of White Wolf Entertainment, who was responsible for the production of Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, the documentary, is undertaking Sasquatch Legend Meets Science Volume 2, and has invited me to work with him on that project to a degree, as an advisor and so forth, but also, more importantly, even more responsibly, to write the companion volume to that book. So that's on my plate, occupying a large part of my plate for this upcoming summer.
Also, what about the journal you work on? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, and that's a great source for people too. I'm managing editor of the Relic Hominoid Inquiry. It's hosted on the ISU webpage, so it's www.isu.edu/RHI. So it's easy to find. If you just Google Relic Hominoid Inquiry, it'll take you there. It's in its 12th year now, and it's not me alone. There's a board of editors. We just reconstituted recently, and so I'm getting my new editors kind of on board. After 10 years, our past board had had shrunk by attrition through the passing of several of our members, but also other responsibilities competing for attention. But we have research papers, we have in-depth book reviews that are very insightful. We have commentaries and news items and technical papers, brief reports, field reports, and so forth.
And not only that, but they are rigorously peer reviewed. And if anybody knows the what goes into being peer reviewed, it is quite extensive.
Right. You know, and this we are you know, obviously we don't have the prejudice against the topic that some of the other mainstream journals might harbor, but it is a rigorous review, and I don't send it out to just friendly faces or sympathetic colleagues. When we get a paper, I you know, search online for the movers and shakers, who's publishing in that discipline or the appropriate field. And you know, a lot of my contacts are cold calls to these individuals, inviting them to participate. And that's what's been very gratifying about this experience, is that there is a lot of intrinsic interest in this subject out there, and the reactions to my invitations have almost unanimously been very, very positive. And I mean, when I say almost, the only rejections I've had are when there were, you know, competing responsibilities or lack of time or be out of the country or whatever. But this provides a great opportunity for networking. People who wouldn't otherwise be directly involved with this topic have been willing to offer their expertise as a reviewer or as a commentator, writing a comment or response to a paper. And it has engendered a lot of dialogue and a lot of very useful feedback. And not every paper makes it. You know, sometimes when the reviews are, you know, the authors just aren't able or willing to rise to the constructive criticisms of the reviewers and decide it's not for them, whatever. But there's been some great papers, as well as another aspect I think I mentioned earlier, is that we've had the opportunity to publish reprints or translations, translated reprints of historical works that have not been available generally to an English-speaking audience. And so it's becoming a great repository of materials relating to not only Sasquatch but relic hominoids around the world.
There's this question here, and I don't understand it. It says, Dr. Meldrum, did you help Sasquatch from Mount St. Helens?
Did they find Sasquatch from?
Did you help save the Sasquatch from Mount St. Helens?
No,
Wow.
no, and there've been all these different you know, stories about corpses, incinerated corpses, or injured Sasquatch with burns, and carted off in helicopters.
That.
You're,
About anything like that.
no.
Also had a question, and I think we already discussed it. I think it's the same line as this. Has the government had a Sasquatch body, or have they incarcerated a Sasquatch?
Well, if they have, I'm oblivious. I'm unaware. It kind of goes back to that earlier discussion where I don't know of any upper level involvement, and all the stories about men in black and unmarked helicopters and people showing up on investigators' doorsteps and confiscating their casts and their files. I mean, no one has ever knocked at my door. You know, so I've joked, well, I must be doing a good job at disseminating disinformation. In fact, one time at a conference fairly recently, this came up during the panel Q&A, and the mic started at the other end. I was in the middle, and each one had their own theory about conspiracies and so forth. And then the mic handed to me, and I just kind of paused there for, you know, for dramatic effect. And then I said, Well, I've thought long and hard about this, and maybe this is the right time that I should finally come clean. I'm not a university professor at all. I'm actually a government agent planted at Idaho State University to disseminate disinformation about Sasquatch. But now it's time, I think, to. And what was funny, there was what was funny was the reaction of the audience, because I'm not kidding. Half the audience was, bursting out into laughter, but the other half were sitting there
Half they didn't know you.
with their eyes like saucers, like, because they actually thought that I was telling the truth.
You have like a 40-year track record and a body of work. If anybody really knew, they'd be like, "Nah, he's joking." You know what I mean?
Right. But it was just, like I said, yeah, who knows? I mean, my impression is the government's not really good at keeping secrets. And so, I've been challenged on that opinion by a couple people who suggested that they knew things that I didn't know and so forth. And that may be, but I don't see any evidence of it whatsoever.
The X-Files doesn't come and ask you your expert opinion on this thing they found.
Right.
That could happen in the future, though. That leads us to this next question. What is the one thing, this will be our last question, that you wish you could locate or experience going forward, aside from an actual sighting?
Oh, aside from.
How do you aside from an actual sighting?
Yeah, I mean, that's because I've caught a glimpse. I've often been asked if I've seen a Sasquatch, and I think I may have. I caught a very fleeting glimpse through night vision. Unfortunately, it was under circumstances that that raised questions about the likelihood of it being authentic. I don't hold those same reservations. It's just a matter of, did I correctly interpret what I think I saw? But I want to have that daytime, when I talk to witnesses who have these daylight encounters and lock eyes with them and have a stare down. That's what I want to. Or to be picked up in a sleeping bag and carted across the countryside. I'd go for that.
That would be the ultimate thing. I really appreciate you spending your time with us, answering all these questions some of us have had our entire lives.
Sure.
I feel satisfied in your answers. I really do.
Well, yeah, some were not answers, just conversations about discussing the ins and outs of it. But there's a lot of unanswered aspects of this. It still remains a mystery, but what an interesting question to contemplate, to pursue.
Somebody had a question like, if I want to be like you, a scientist, and they put it as a scientist studying Bigfoot instead of an anthropologist, where would I start?
Well, what I tell young people to do, young or old, is to select a discipline that you are passionate about, and it doesn't have to be anthropology. It could be molecular biology, DNA sequencing. It could be bioacoustics. It could be cultural anthropology. It could be fiber analysis. In other words, a discipline that has that embodies skills that could be applied to some type of evidence that bears on the question of Sasquatch, and then something that you really enjoy doing, because this, at least at the beginning of your career, is going to be a small part, and you'll probably have to keep it very close to the vest until you have some job security. If you're in academia, that means you've got to get tenure and have a little bit before being allowed the full potential of academic freedom that supposedly offers. And then, not only pursue that, but become authoritative, or an authority. That's a better way to say it. Become an authority in your discipline. And once you have that job security, then apply those skills and those techniques to questions around the possible existence of Sasquatch or some other relic hominoid. Then you can do it from a position of credibility and authority. But I tell you, I wouldn't recommend the path that I followed, because I was I rather say idealistic rather than saying naive, but I think there was a certain degree of naivete in my jumping into the deep end of the pool even before I had tenure, and it nearly cost me my career, my job, at least the present job, because of the reaction of my colleagues within my department and across campus and elsewhere, and it has continued to be a thorn in delaying promotions and so forth and other recognition. And so, I had an idealistic notion of science and a very apolitical approach to my own colleagues. And boy, I tell you, it did reveal an unpleasant underbelly to this community. Science is made up of a community of people who have all the foibles and all the idiosyncrasies of any other cross section of humanity in any other community. And I discovered that all too abruptly when this kind of hit the fan, so to speak. So
that's another interest of mine, the politics that exist in science.
Yeah.
People have no idea.
Oh yeah, no, it's really, and especially when it comes to things like paleoanthropology, it becomes very politically charged, and because of the rarity of the specimens and the the plentiful individuals eager to analyze those and have access to those, it can become quite a dog-eat-dog environment.
Even the things that might rewrite history a little bit from the way we know it now.
Sure. I mean, there are dogmas, there are things. One of the interesting things about my involvement with this subject is that it has provided some fresh perspective as I turn my attention back to my study, say, of the Laetoli hominin footprints, for example, fossil hominin footprints, and the whole notion of this unexpected at the time flat, flexible foot with a non-divergent big toe. That turned out to be the standard adaptation. Early hominins walked on a more Sasquatch-like foot with a non-divergent big toe and a flat, flexible foot with a mid-tarsal break for millions of years successfully.
I just got to show the picture again real quick. This is you holding up the foot. And the thing that caught me right the first time I saw it is if you can look at where part of it's flaked off on the bottom, and that is right at the flex there. It looks like it was because of the pressure and the mud that was on the actual foot.
Well, I'm not sure what you're seeing flaked off there. There are dry desiccation cracks where the mud in which the footprint was left began to dry as the sun came out. The rain abated and the sun came out. But this footprint doesn't show a real distinctive pressure ridge because the substrate it's walking on is a hard pan sort of logging landing at a construction site in the forest there, covered with that pulverized dust that the big rigs, leave behind, that they grind up. But you've got this hard pan with the dust that was wet down by the rain. So when it stepped, it squished right through that layer of mud and hit the hard pan, kind of flattened out. So the hard pan wouldn't yield, wouldn't give to create a pressure ridge. But what was interesting about this occasion is that whatever was leaving the tracks apparently was spooked by someone arriving on the scene, and it ran back to the tree line with twice the stride or step length and running up on the front half of its foot. So it left a series of what I call half tracks. Well, if we sprinted on our toes, we would be on the ball of the foot. We'd have an abbreviated track, but we'd be poised because of our stiff arch up on the ball of the foot. These creatures don't have an arch to support the foot in that posture, so it collapses into flexion across the mid-tarsus, and it leaves a half track, the entire forefoot. And that can only be explained by the presence of this flexible set of joints through the instep. So it further corroborates the mid-tarsal flexibility model in a very elegant way.
It's endlessly fascinating. Thank you very much for being here. I
Yeah.
appreciate it. It was worth it every minute.
Good.
Thank you again. You have a good evening. This is Dr. Jeff Meldrum, everybody. He is a professor at Idaho State University of Anthropology and a few other things.
Yeah.
He's a busy man, so I really appreciate him spending his time with us.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. You have a good night.
You too. Thank you.
That was an awesome interview, guys. I learned some things before I wrap it up here that I've always wanted to know about Bigfoot, and that is, where's the body? And now that's answered in my mind. Where is the scat? Now that's answered in my mind. So, I mean, it's just amazing. I'd like to thank him very much. You've been listening, or you've been watching Midnight Radio. I'd like to thank you very much. That was Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Until next time, good night, and God bless. I'm going to put links to everything we went over tonight in the description right there below the video, and I'm going to put some of the things he was talking about, the Relict Hominid Inquiry, the Sasquatch Field Guide. I'll probably make a video of what you should do, a short. I'm going to make a YouTube short of him talking about what you should do if you want to preserve some scat and mail it to him in the mail. So until next time, good night, God bless, and all my best.